Hello, this is Scott Ramsey with our weekly video Bible study. And today we're going to be looking at Ecclesiastes, long word, Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 1 through 8. Just 8 verses today. So it may be kind of short today. But I think that this is a unit that makes sense to look at as one unit before we move on into the rest of the chapter. And so I want to look at these 8 verses and talk about, we want to remember that Solomon wrote this book and that he's speaking now in the voice of the teacher or the preacher or the philosopher. He's created this character that is giving you his philosophy of life. And we know from reading it that he's talking about himself. He's talking about his more earthly and uh, profane and uninspired philosophies of life that he's had in the past. And he's talking about those approaches to life and how those approaches always lead you to conclude that life is vanity and meaningless and smoke. And so this is another one of those approaches. And in this one, he looks at uh, what one writer has called a view from the top. A view from the top. And we think about this saying. I want to give you a saying that someone made up one time. And think about it and think to see if you know what this means. Have you ever heard this saying before? That nothing succeeds like success. What does that mean? It means that I think what it includes is that success for us is a very tempting thing. The call of success, the seeking after success, and sometimes it takes on a life of its own. And sometimes success becomes a spiral upwards to the top, so to speak. When you get to the top, though, you find out that it's just the top of ordinary stuff. It isn't uh, the heaven that some people make it out to be. That success is everything, and once you find success, you'll be happy, you'll be content, you'll find your purpose. That's not always the case. In fact, it's almost never the case. And so Solomon found this out for himself in his life. Solomon was born to King David, who was one of the great kings of Israel. And between David and Solomon, in that time period, Israel had its greatest success as a nation, as far as territory, and as far as its military, and as far as its wealth under David and then Solomon. The kingdom was at its success. It was at the top, and Solomon, being the king, was at the top of the country in a sense. He had the two areas which usually are thought of with success, which are money and power. He had a lot of both of those, and so you would have thought that would have been everything he needed to be at the top, to be a success, would be everything he needed to have meaning for his life. But we're going to read this book right now, this section of the book right now, chapter 4, verses 1 through 8. And you'll see that the view from the top is not pretty. It's really not that different from your view or my view, um, as far as the opportunity to see uh, Hevel, to see that life is vanities. Being at the top doesn't protect you from that realization that life can be, if you look at it without God, you can see it being very much pessimistic and without hope and meaningless And that can happen at the top as well as at the bottom. The people at the bottom don't believe that. We think that once we get to the top, everything would be so different and our life would be charmed. If you meet people who are at the top and you talk to them, you'll find out that's not true. Or even people who are on their way to the top, you will find out that they sometimes pay a very heavy price for that journey. But let's look at the book and read a few verses, and we'll talk about those. Chapter 4, verses 1 through, let's do 1 through 3. Because the first thing you see from the top is oppression. Oppression. The philosopher saw the oppression which took place among people. He says, "Again I looked and saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they had no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they had no comforter. And I declared that the dead who have already died are happier than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been born, who has not seen evil that is done under the sun." A pretty grim picture of life. And he'd seen it all. He was the king, and he knew about politics. He knew about struggle for acceptance and for uh, political power and military power and money. His family was involved in politics. There was politics involved in his ascension to the throne when his father died. There was conflict among the members of the family, among David's sons. Remember, David had many wives and concubines. And so there was a big family and lots of intrigue, we like to call it. So he was aware of all that. He was aware of the abuse of power. He was aware that things are done by people with power. They do bad things for good reasons, this kind of reasoning. They do bad things for bad reasons too, but they do a lot of bad things. And those bad things often end up oppressing other people. And so this quest for success that led him to be the king of Israel uh, was disappointing to him. It seems very much that he was disappointed because he looked at his own life and looked at this success that he had had, and he really asked himself quite honestly, is this my purpose? Does this give me my purpose? Do I know what my purpose is by the fact that I'm king and that I am, in some senses, at the top of my field or the top of my game? And the first thing he saw when he looked at life from the top was oppression. And notice he says that those who are oppressed are miserable, they have no comforter. Those who do the oppressing also have no comforter. And he says, I think that someone who's dead is better off than the living, because the dead are not oppressed. They're gone. The life of oppression and suffering, it's over. But then he says something even more sad than that. He says those who've not yet been born are better off than those who were born. Now think about that, and think about what a depressing view of life that is. And this depressing view of life, I think what we see here is that it comes from looking to the wrong place for your purpose, looking to the wrong place for your reason for being. And we know that the Bible gives us plenty on the real reason for being. And we'll see that when we get to the end of the book. This same man who in chapter 4 is so down on life, By the time he gets to the end of the chapter, he'll figure it out, and we'll see that. But at this point, he's looking at life under the sun, which is a view of life that takes no account of God. And so from the top, he sees only oppression. The second thing he sees is envy. He says that when you get to the top or on your way to the top, there's lots of envy and rivalry. Let's look at the next few verses, verses 4 through 6. Chapter 4, verses 4 through 6. Let's read those. And I saw that all labor and all achievement spring from man's envy of his neighbor. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. The fool folds his hand and ruins himself. Better is one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. And so here he's saying that in our system today, in our world today, the world of people, that achievement and labor spring from envy of each other. We call this keeping up with the Joneses. Is what we call that. And if you think about the biblical counterpoint to this, I think that we think about the words of Jesus about contentment and about not building up treasures for yourself on earth. I also think about the commandment not to covet. Thou shalt not covet. Because when you start coveting things, you start trying to get ahead of your neighbor. Now, does this mean you shouldn't have things? That's not the point. Where is your heart? Is your heart spurred on by keeping ahead of other people or keeping up with other people? That's the rat race that Jesus is saying to avoid. That's the rat race that the law is saying to avoid. And so this writer is giving us an earthly counterpoint to the wisdom of God. He's saying, in this world, and in his case, the world of politics and the world of the royal family of Israel, all labor and all achievement springs from one man's envy of his neighbor. That's quite a statement. But I can't argue with that. And that's what happens. He's talking here about what actually happens, not how it should be, not how God wants it to be, not how we should strive to follow God. But he's saying this is the way that people do it most often. And with a view to ignore God, this is the way it will turn out. You're not thinking about your purpose with God. You're not asking yourself, what is God's will? Or what is my place in God's plan? No. Your plan under this kind of thinking is, how do I get ahead? And ahead of what? Ahead of my neighbor. Because that's what drives you in this kind of thinking. And this kind of thinking is a picture that Solomon is pointing to us of traps that he had fallen into before, and traps that he wanted others to avoid. And so the book of the book of Ecclesiastes is kind of a negative example. He's saying, don't be like this. Don't have this limited thinking that is driven on by envy of your neighbor. So he sees oppression under the sun. When he's looking down at everybody else, the system from the top, he sees oppression, he sees envy, and he sees disillusionment. He experiences disillusionment. Let's read verses 7 and 8. Again, I saw something meaningless under the sun. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil, yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling? He asked, and why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? This too is meaningless, a miserable business. This reminds me of two things. This reminds me of um, this question. He's asked this question before in this book. We've read him ask this question before about this thought about, okay, I'm toiling, I'm working, I'm building things in my life, but why? What when I die, when I pass into the next world, what happens to the stuff? What happens to the wealth? What's the purpose of me doing this beyond just my own life? And so this question sounds a lot to me like the same thing that this man is asking. He says there in the last part of 8, he says, "For whom am I toiling?" He asked, "and why am I depriving myself of enjoyment?" But also I see in his mindset, in the first part of verse 8, there was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil, and his eyes were not content with his wealth. That description sounds to me a lot like, you remember the story that Jesus told in the Gospels, where he tells the story about the rich man, the rich fool, who was very rich, had lots of stuff, and had just come across more stuff, was well exceeding in business, and in his case, agriculture, I think. And he said, "What will I do with my stuff? I'll build more barns to put my stuff in. I've got all this stuff. I have more crops. I have more hay. I don't know if it was hay or wheat or what it was, but I've got more stuff. What do I do with it? Well, I build more barns for myself." Notice there was in that little story that Jesus tells, there's nobody else around. It's just for him. And I'll build more barns for my stuff. But what happens next in the story of the rich fool? It says that night God spoke to him and said, "Tonight your soul is required of you." And so that stuff, whether it's in a barn or not, it's left behind, isn't it? There's a story of two people who were at the funeral of a very rich man. And this rich man was known in his community as having all this money. And people didn't know how much money he had, but it was everywhere. He owned businesses, he owned property. He was very wealthy. And these two people were kind of whispering to each other at the funeral before the service started. And one of them said, "I wonder how much money he left behind." And the other person said, "Well, I know exactly how much money he left behind." And the first guy said, "Well, how much was it?" Because he was expecting some huge dollar figure that would blow him out of his seat. He said, "So how much did he leave behind?" And the second man said, "All of it. All of it." I think saying to us that at that point the amount doesn't really matter. If it was one penny or if it was $100 million or more than that, it's all left behind. And so these are the questions that this man is dealing with in verse 8, but also Solomon, as king of Israel, had to deal with this because he was very wealthy and very powerful. And so here he's dealing with the fact that even when you're at the top, that success, however you define success, it might be success in your business or in your family or in your whatever field you want to think about. Success, we have this idea that success is that one person who gets it right. Um, and we have these myths that we tell ourselves about success. And one of those myths is that it just happens. Uh, what we see here is success costs you stuff. Success will cost you heavily to get there and to stay there. And then you'll be asking yourself, was it worth it? And maybe it was. You might decide that some of the things that you sacrificed were worth sacrificing to get where you are. But he decided that it really wasn't enough to give his life purpose. And that's what he's looking for here is purpose. How do I find purpose in this life? And so this is the view from the top that we have by Solomon, looking at uh, the questions of now I'm successful. Now what? What does it mean? How do I enjoy and how do I find meaning in my success? And for him, the three things he saw from the top were oppression, envy, and disillusionment. Not a very pretty picture. So again, think about where you get your meaning for life. This is another thing we've looked at. We've looked at so many different fields already, and we'll see more of them as we go forward into this book, where the preacher is looking at different aspects of life and trying to find meaning under the sun. And so we'll see if he finds it next week. There's your lead in for next week. We'll start in verse 9 of chapter 4 next week and probably finish the chapter. But read verse 9. Verse 4. I'm sorry. Read chapter 4 for next week. And we'll start with verse 9 and go to the end of the chapter. And you'll be ready because you will have read it and you'll be all studied up. And try not to be put off by the fact that this book seems very depressing. Remember, it's like a negative example. It's saying this is life without God. When we get to chapter 12, he'll finally get the point. He'll finally find the right answer. And he'll say it, and you'll just be like, oh, okay, he got it. Also, you might go through and read a few Psalms for every chapter of Ecclesiastes that you read. It might help you, inspire you to a godly view of life instead of this view of life under the sun. So just something to think about. And I'll see you next week for Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 9 and following. Thanks a lot. We'll see you then.